Okay, I turned on the recording. Thank you for joining today on May 11th. Let's see here. Just want to make sure I notice the chat. So if you noticed, I dropped a link into the chat. It's a link to a repo. Instead of using slides today, I went ahead and I just made a README file for the repo so we can kind of use that as our guide. And if you have interest in building this later in your own lab environment, then you can use this repo as your blueprint, as well as there's some two like work in progress pieces where I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you to actually bring this up in the Ansible automation controller, which is also a segue into the second half today, where I'm going to show you how to access an Ansible automation controller from a Red Hat lab. So that way, if you haven't installed one in your own environment, you can go there and use this one and still be able to use repositories, Git repositories, and be able to point it to either your own lab or to DevNet or to somewhere where you have devices, or to the CML topology. That one is a little bit different because it requires a VPN. So that one I'm unable to use, or I haven't figured out a easy way to target that one at the moment. But there are always on routers in the Cisco DevNet, so that's what we'll use today. So having said that, let me go ahead and bring up this repository. Can you guys see the screen okay? Should I make it a little bit bigger for the writing? Does it look okay?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to go through these files, these playbooks, in a particular order. I kind of wanted to walk you through all the different permutations of using Ansible to back up router configurations. The good news is that it's a similar process across vendors. So for this particular one, I wanted to use the Cisco always on environment to make it easier for everybody if they want to use this repo and then point it to their routers. They're always on. Hence, no need to worry about lab topology. But for Juniper and Arista and the other ones, I didn't really have an easy way to do that. So the process will be similar, but we're going to look at Cisco today. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone's clear that part of this is that it's a consistent process, and you could back up really any vendor that has a collection that includes the config module. You would be able to back them up in a similar way. The challenge is there's so many different targets that you can back up to, and depending on which tool or which Ansible core engine you're using, then it would be a different process. So that's why I have quite a few examples here in this repo. So one of the ones that you may have looked at already and have experience with is using just the Ansible core engine installed on your laptop or on a server and just running Ansible-playbook commands. So that one is really straightforward because it just saves those configs to the the server that you're running where the Ansible core engine is installed. So we'll take a look at that one first. But before I get into that, just to give you an idea of what's needed, if you were to run through these yourself later, it would, for the first one, it would definitely require you to install Ansible Core Engine in your environment. So there's that. If you wanted to do the Ansible Navigator example, which is our second one that we'll look at, then obviously you would need to pip install Ansible Navigator into your environment. But that's where things start to diverge, because when we work with the Ansible Navigator, we are using execution environments. So in this particular repo, I have an Ansible Navigator configuration. And if you attended our study group 2 weeks ago, we went through the Ansible Navigator, and we saw that it pulls down a container image. So I have a repository on GitLab, a container repository that's a part of GitLab, and network-EE is an execution environment that has collections already built in that execution environment. So it has iOS, iOS XE, iOS XR, It has Juniper. It has Arista. It has many of the collections that typically you would use for network automation. So that one is a good execution environment in terms of network automation. So that's the one that we'll use here. So you can also pull this execution environment down in your own environment if you build one, for your own lab purposes. So the next thing is the Ansible automation platform. So I'm running Ansible automation platform 2.3. The execution environment should work with 2.2 if you have an older one. I probably wouldn't go too much older than that, just to make sure that we're not breaking any dependencies in terms of the version of the Ansible core engine that's running inside the container, which is one of the other deltas. If you install Ansible core engine, locally in your environment, you can do that globally, or you can create a virtual environment, which is the suggested way, and you're installing Ansible core engine as a Python application in your environment, along with any other Python dependencies. When we use the execution environments, then all of those same things are already installed in the container. So the Ansible core engine is running in that container. And that's where things start to look differently, especially when we're starting to look at file systems. So in terms of saving files and copying files and the like, that's what we're doing when we're backing up configs. So it's a great example of how do we manipulate our playbooks so that it can work using the execution environments. So we'll see that. And in terms of an Ansible automation platform, again, if you don't have one, you'll be able to use Instruct Lab environment, the self study lab environment from Red Hat, and we're going to look at that in the second half. So I'll show you like how to reserve a pod, similar to like what you do with DevNet sandboxes, but like in our case, you just have to go to a landing page and then you can open up the environment. And depending on which one you select, then it would have a different time limit available. So I think the one that I found that works pretty good actually has like almost 2 hours before it times out. So it gives you enough time to go in there and build environments and test them out. So that way you don't have to keep rebuilding your environment. And as always, and someone's trying to get in, let me grab them real quick. As always, we're able to save our work into our My project. So that's, we'll continue to go through those iterations as well. So anything that we're using in terms of these labs, you're saving your work in that repo. And if you haven't done so, just go back into the lab guide. And if anyone's joining for the first time, let me just grab the link to that real quick. And I'll put it into the chat. And you'll be able to follow us today. And don't worry if you don't have all the prerequisite stuff set up. Because we're doing the controller, we're kind of going from scratch, but there are some pieces that you may need from the previous labs. And you can just watch me and then go back and build those by going back to previous sections in the lab guide for that. But for what we're doing now, we're in this GitLab repository. And so again, if you don't have a navigator or an automation platform, there's a lab for that. I would encourage you over time, as you become more familiar, to try to install like in your own personal lab and then work from those. So the way that that this works is for most of these examples, we're saving the configs to a server. So one of the examples is to the automation controller. So we're running that container and the files are there temporarily. So you can think of it as being like ephemeral. And then we're going to copy them from the container to the AAP controller server. Another example that I'm going to go through is actually saving them to an external server that's running in AWS. So we can, effectively, we can save these configs anywhere. We just have to have the proper credentials and connectivity configured in our Ansible to be able to manage those particular servers, depending on what OS and, all the other nuances there. And then the last one is interesting. It's saving the configs to a repo. So the way that we would do that is consistent with the CI/CD pipeline, where we're going to save our configs into a new stage in the repo. So that way, each one of them has a commit ID, and also the stage has an ID. So that way, if we wanted to do like rollbacks, we would be able to roll back to a previous config backup that was saved into a stage. Or if we wanted to promote those to the main branch, we could do that as well. So maybe these are the configs that are promoted into the main branch that we're going to push back into our devices, or we're going to alter them in some way and then push it back into the devices. So we'll kind of see, like, from a net DevOps standpoint, how we can also leverage backups in that regard. So those are the different scenarios. And in terms of what you're going to see, you will see me use the navigator in the GUI, right? So for the GUI, I don't have like all the screenshots of everything that I configured from the GUI. Alternatively, in the way that I normally do this is I'm going to create a playbook, and everything that is provided in this repo, I'm going to come back and include a playbook, so that way you can just run the playbook, and then you build your AAP controller as code. So that way you don't even have to touch the GUI. It'll build everything that you see in the GUI as code, just using a collection, and effectively, underneath the collection is the REST APIs. So that's the typical way that we would do this, is controller as code type of methodology to save time. One warning: because we're using the Cisco Sandbox, the always on, I noticed last night that one of the routers had an issue, like a hardware issue, and it looks like it still does today. I assume that normally, I thought they reboot them like every night or whatever. So I have two routers. One of the routers I'm going to turn off in my host inventory, so that way we don't have to see the errors of it not being able to connect. But I'll go ahead and for the repo purposes, I'll change it back to having both of those hosts, so that way you can iterate through two different routers and see what it looks like from an inventory perspective. But one of them is failing, so I took it out just because it's just kind of a nuisance. But that is something that you have to keep in mind, that in the sandbox, sometimes, because it's just it's publicly available and always on, that sometimes people just do things to it, like maybe they turn on debugging or something crazy, and that router just takes a dive. And you're not always able to find somebody at Cisco to be able to, or easily find somebody to turn it back on. So that's kind of where we're at with that one. So kind of a net is it's kind of hit and miss. So at least by having two, you have a 50% chance that you'll connect to one or the other, right? And then best case, you'll connect to both of them. So the controller, let me grab this real quick. Sorry about that. Back here. This is just an example of what the error message might look like from the controller. You'll just see that it's just connections being reset. And then if you ran like SSH to it, like I did, and I could probably check right now and see what it's doing. Just different, refusal to connect and other errors like that. So let me bring up a terminal. Just give it a shot. See what happens. Hey, look, maybe it is working. Okay. And you can see that they upgraded from a CSR 1000V to a Catalyst 8000V. Just see what's in here. Okay. Yeah, so it's pretty much the same config that they had with the CSR 1000V. So maybe there's just some issues with the way they set up now that they're using the Catalyst, but it's using that same domain name. So what I could do, now that we have two of them, I can go into my repo, and this will give you a good example of how this works. So in my repo, if I go into repository and then into these files, I have a host.yaml. This is my inventory. And you can see that I commented out that particular one that wasn't working. So I can either fix it locally, or I can fix it from here, and then I can pull it down locally to sync up my local repo with the GitLab repo. So what I want to do is I'll just open it up here, which brings up like a VS Code inside of GitLab, and I'll fix it here. And you got to remember to save it. So Control S is one way of saving it. And then see this right here is the source control icon. If I click on that, I can go ahead and either provide a message or just click on it. It'll accept without the message, but I'll do commit. And see here it says either commit to a new branch or no to use the current branch. So we're going to do that one. Go back to project. And I'll get rid of this. And I guess I won't leave two of them open. I'll just go back to there. So now we fixed it here. So if I go here to host, right, there's no more comment out. And if I go locally, though, mine has it commented. So I got to do a pull to reconcile that. See how it shows that there was one change, right? So now it's uncommented here. So we're in sync. So if I do the get status, it'll show that we're all up to date on the main branch and everything's good. So with that being said, then for the first part of this, I wanted to show you like just a basic backup. So has anyone, let me go back to the main screen here, over here, just to make sure, just to gauge where everybody's at. In the emojis, just give me a thumbs up if you have used Ansible to do just a basic config backup before. Okay. Okay, so a few of you have. So for those who haven't, we're just going to run through that one real quickly so we can use it to compare and contrast against. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'll bring up my VS Code here, and I'm just running locally on my laptop. So if I look at this playbook, where's it at? What did I call it? Old school. Back. Oh, that's where I'm saving them. Where's the playbook at? Oldschool.yaml. So this is just a simple backup, and it's using the iOS_config module that's a part of the iOS collection from Cisco. And the parameter that you set if you want to do a backup is just true for backup. Now, if you do that, it'll save it in your project. So this is my project right here, this simple backup. So this is my working directory, my project. It'll create inside that project a folder that's named backups. So if you don't want to use a folder named backups, with the default setting, then you can use the second parameter called backup_options, and then you can define a directory path. So what I did is I created this old school backups, which is this folder right here from this playbook. And you can see that I ran it before and I have some backups in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. All right, so there's nothing in there now. And we'll go ahead and run it as a playbook. I don't have to explicitly add the inventory, which is this file right here, host.yaml, because it's defined in this ansible.config. So just to point that out, it knows where it is because of this setting is overriding the default configuration. And that's all these are. These are just settings where I wanted to override a default. And this works locally when I'm using Ansible-playbook. And for some of these, it works also for Ansible Navigator. But just keep in mind, some of the configurations have been moved into this Ansible-navigator.yaml file. And I'll differentiate between the two here shortly. So with this particular one here, let me make this a little bit larger. When I run this playbook, it should hit both of those routers, and it did. And then I should be able to go into this here and then see those routers. They're backups. So by default, it will append the timestamp. So we can see that it's the host name here of each router, latest-1 and this recom-1. And then it also appended _config. So these are just the defaults. Now, if you wanted to change these defaults, you could in that playbook. You would just have to change that here. There's like another parameter to change the name of the backup. But by default, it'll just use _config and then the actual date and timestamps, which is good because that differentiates our backup. So as we run these, we can just look at the date and time, and we can see the newer backups versus the older ones, and we can work from that. So that's pretty easy and straightforward. And we're working, in this directory that we have access to. Now, where it becomes a bit more difficult is the Ansible Navigator, because now with the Navigator, it's going to run inside an execution environment. So this is the image of the execution environment, and this Ansible-Navigator file will say that when you run Ansible Navigator, it's going to run Ansible Core Engine inside this container image. So that means that we have to address that in our playbook, because effectively we're working inside that container. We can access that container using the exec command. And I talked about that on the last session. So if you go back and look at that recording, it'll give you a good idea of how you use exec if you want to see what's going on like inside these execution environments. But just keep in mind, that's where it's executing the playbook. So if we run that and we create a backup, then we're actually storing it inside that container. So that's problematic. So the second playbook that we have is the backup YAML, this one. So I'll just walk through this. The README file that I have in that Git repository, it also goes through and it tries to explain, everything that we're doing here. So you can follow along with that, or like afterwards. Don't worry if you're not capturing, everything as we're going through it this time. You'll be able to use that as a reference as well. So in this playbook, you can see that we have two different groups in our inventory. So one of the groups is iOS, and that's our routers. But then we also have local servers group, which is the IP address of my lab environment server that's running AAP. So effectively, I want to save those backups to my AAP server in my lab. So I have to use a username that has access, to be able to elevate privilege to sudo, and I can, at that point, I can read and write directories and all that stuff, all that Linux stuff. And then this is just the IP address of the server in my local lab. So the piece that you don't have here is the password, right? So you wouldn't necessarily be able to use this, right, without the password. So normally when we're working local, we can create credentials, but what we should do is encrypt those credentials. So for this particular one, it's going to leverage a vault file, and that's what this is. So this is my password, but it's been encrypted with AES 256 encryption key, or crypto rather, and that prevents anyone from seeing what my password is locally. So I'm using this, for the Ansible Navigator, because I need to touch the server from the container. So it's really like the container. You could look at that as being like a remote connection back to the server, and then this gives me privilege to be able to do that. So in this particular playbook, backups.yaml, I'll use Ansible Navigator. So Ansible, and I'll explain more about the playbook too as we run this. Navigator, the run command, and it's backup. YAML, -m standard output. Right, so we'll run this here, and it'll pull down the container image, and then that's where the Ansible Core Engine is. So it just ran it against those two routers, and then copy to AAS server, or AAP server rather. That is the second task. So if I go back to the playbook here, the first one is similar to what we did with just the old school backups, right? We went ahead and said backup is true. And then for backup options, my path is to a temporary directory called backups. But this directory is actually inside that container. So what I have to do is copy it from that container directory that I have access to, because my core engine, is running in that container. And then I want to save it over to this tilde means my home directory, and then create a folder called backups. So this is the home directory on my AAP server. So for me to access that one, I can actually SSH into it from my laptop. Oops. All right, so now I'm in the AAP server in the host directory. And you can see that there's a folder called backups. Now this one I forgot to delete all the backups. So let me just do that real quick. Oops. Just get rid of all those backups. I'll run it one more time. It'll just take a second. Hey, what happened here? Hold on, let me make sure everything's good. Change local server, host.
Oh, you connected to the .50, not .58, 158 with SSH.
Hold on a second.
The connection, the SSH connection to the server. Not sure if it's correct. Oh no, it was wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, see why I didn't go in there. Yeah, it should just go into there. It's like, what happened to it? What did I change? All right, so let's take a look at this. So one thing that I could try here. Local server, TWL. My password's in here. The playbook over here. Oops. That's what we named it, right? Yeah, local server. See if that makes a difference. We'll do the verbosity in a second to see what's going on. Get out of here. It's saving it somewhere. That's just my repo. Get out of that. Move. That's really bizarre. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I didn't need delegate because I'm doing conditions. Let me get rid of that. File. Well, one thing we'll do is we'll figure out what's going on here. But I just want to do a check to see if I broke it, because this is my repo has been updated except for just the change that I just made. So I can sync that real quick, and this will be the same code that we're running in AAP. So let me go ahead and commit this. Control S. It's out of there. We'll figure out what's going on. All right, so now the repo's all synced up. So if we go back to which one? So you guys, yeah, here's my controller. I'm logged in as backups. So I only see my backup job templates just to keep it less cluttered, just using the roles-based access. So the one that we're talking about is this one. So let's see what happens when I run this now from here. It takes it a second because it's got to pull down the repo and all that stuff. All right, so this one looks like it did something. Oh, but wait a minute, back up. Yeah, back up and then copy local server. Yeah. Yeah, it looks, the other one looked like it worked as well. So now let's go back into here. Oops, not here. Oh, interesting. So yeah, this one's kind of got me a little confused because I'm using the exact same playbook, but I'm running it in an execution environment from the AAP, which is, the exact same execution environment, right? So if I look at my templates, go in here, and I can see it's network EE, so the exact same container. I have my credentials because that's one thing that's different about AAP is that instead of like using Vault credentials that we would typically do locally, I can create credentials in AAP to accomplish the same thing. If I want to use Vault, and I do use Vault in a couple of these examples just to show you how it works, then I would create a credential for Vault so that it has the password to decrypt the Vault. So in this particular credential here, it'll be like the username and password for my AAP rel server in that credential. Right, it should just be a username and password. You can't see the password. So if I had hosed up the password, I wouldn't be able to connect. So I'm pretty confident that in my vault, I'm okay in terms of the password. So it shouldn't be that. It's kind of odd. So let's see. Let's see if another one in Ansible Navigator gives me fits. So so this was to the AAP server, and it appears to work. But let's do it one more time with verbosity, right? So maybe we'll see something. We go ahead and crank out a little bit more verbosity in the output. Which a lot of stuff is on the screen now. Probably shouldn't have did that many V's. It's going to take up like the whole buffer. Right, so here is the copy one.
Now the destination is root backup.
Oh, yeah.
Because you have become true in the task.
Yeah, but it should have grabbed
Yeah, no.
my username. Let me try this because sometimes when I change these, it depends on what you use. So in the local one here, well, let's see what I have in the host. host file, right? I think I did like remote user or whatever. Let's try this. So I could ignore that one. Yeah, good eye. No, let's not do as many V's. I think 2 would probably be good. So this time it's talking about home TDBL backups. So let's take a look at it now. Yeah, so we have more. Let me delete them and we'll just run it one more time. Yeah, so it tried to, by default, it will use root. So I didn't want that parameter. So that was a mistake here. And the reason why it didn't work locally is because, as I mentioned in AAP, I have that credential and it had the tdubial and the password, and that would override what we had in the inventory. So in the inventory, it didn't have this username set. So you know what I probably did is in my vault, I only have the password. So I needed to set this parameter, not this parameter. This one for this particular use case doesn't do anything. So that's good that we caught that. So let me run it one more time, and then we'll see that it'll work again. But I do admit that a lot of times when I'm doing all these different combinations, I kind of change things and forget where I'm at sometimes, and that's probably what happened. So should be able to see those again. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and, well, I might as well change that here. And it's not really changed until we do this. So I'll go ahead again and see. Did I change it? I'll be putting something more descriptive in here too. So I need to get better at that. Okay, so now if we go back in here to the repo, and I should be able to see that if I refresh. Yeah. Now the interesting thing is, like, for the remote server, I think this did work as is. So we'll find out if it's the case with that one as well. So for a remote server, the difference is I have to use a username, but also an SSH key instead of a password. So if we look at the files here, well, actually, it's better if I look at it locally. So if we look at the files here locally, the reason why I need to look at this locally from this viewpoint is because these vault files, I'm not sending them to the Git repository. So how does that work? So what I'm doing is I have this .gitignore, and you can see that anything named vault.yaml is excluded from when I update my files. So if I do a git add all, it ignores these, right? So some of the things that I don't want to send are artifacts. In my artifacts, these are every one of our playbook runs. I'm saving them. So I can go back later and click on them, and I can see the output. So it's just good for historical purposes, especially like those kind of things when I'm troubleshooting. So there's that, but I don't want to send those into my repo. So I filter those out. And then some of the other things where the vault, Ansible config is typically used locally. So I'm not using it for anything that I'm running in my AAP. So when my AAP pulls down the repo, there's really no reason for this one, because it could actually cause some issues, because in the Ansible.config file for that remote server, I'm using a default override there to include specifically where my SSH key is. But this only makes sense on my laptop right now. So if I send this to the AAP controller, it's not going to be able to find this key. So the correct way of configuring it there with a credential would be to add the private key into the credential. And I'll show you the credential on that side. It'll be encrypted, so you won't be able to see my key anyway. So this is just sitting, on my laptop, and I have access to it because I have access locally to my environment when I run Ansible-playbook in my project directory. But also, if I have access, to the rest of the file system, then I can find those files. For Ansible Navigator, I had to take it a step further. So for Ansible Navigator, I did a volume mount. So you can see that I opened up to my home directory, but I could mount to anywhere on the server. But this is typically where I want to have access to those types of files. So for the container to have access outside of the project. So the project that I'm working in, I can see. So I can see these playbooks and other files from that container. But anything outside of my project that I pull down from the Git repository, then I would have to explicitly mount a volume so that I have access to it. Otherwise, it'll just keep saying it's unable to find the file. So the file that it needs to find is that key. So that's how it has access to that key in my home directory. And there was something else too. The key for my vault. Typically, you don't keep your key to your vault in your repo either. Even aside from this git ignore, it's just best practice to put it in a hidden folder somewhere, or somewhere outside of the project that you're working on, and then you point to that key to decrypt your vault. So my vault file is only here locally, but you won't see this in my repo. So just to show you that, to confirm it, when we go into that section like group vars up here, you'll notice that there's no vault here, but locally in group vars under iOS, here's a vault file. So it's never sent into the repo. So it's common sense, right? Like any type of sensitive file or credential, you really don't want to put it in a Git repo. And if you do, then make sure that it's vaulted, because you could do that. And I'll show you that in another example later. I do have one that we can actually use vault if we want to in the controller. But the best practice is normally using credentials on the AAP. And then sometimes credentials could even be other systems outside of AAP. So the controller has integrations with other solutions like CyberArk, HashiCorp Vault, other Vault tools that you can manage credentials with directly. And then the AAP would just point to those for credentials. So we'll take a look at credentials, because I needed to do something interesting for GitLab. I needed to create a custom credential, and you can do that as well. So there's so many different types of credentials available inside AAP, and if you need something in addition to, then you can create a custom credential, and that can include all sorts of other environment variables or extra variables that you want to encrypt. So that way you could move things that are like typically out in the open if you need to, like these vars files, and those could be also included within a credential. So it's kind of cool and easy to be able to provide those. So we'll look at those too. So the second one was to a remote server. So we'll try this one, this remote backup, and you'll see that it looks just like the other playbook. But what's different here is the group is different, remote servers. So back to our host, we can see we have remote servers, and this is a public IP to a server that's running in AWS. So it's kind of the same scenario, and we'll see if this remote user works properly for this particular one, or if I need to change that. So we'll go ahead and I'll up arrow key and change the playbook to remote, backup. Oh, I didn't change the verbosity. All right, so it looks like it did its thing here. I went to the home directory on this with this EC2 user to backups. So we'll check this one. So for me to see this one, I'll bring up. Oh, you know what? I don't have. Oh, let's see. What was the IP? Here's the IP. All right, so we'll attempt to log into this one. EC2-user at that, but I need the key, so I gotta go through all that. So I think I just have it in that home directory, right? So it's not finding that. Let's see, like SSH. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. I lost my tab there. Just give me a second. Looks like it's still recording, so that's good. Go back to Bluetooth. On. This. Okay, is it still? Can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry about that. That time the whole browser crashed. Something was going on with Chrome. All right, so I am not sharing my screen anymore. All that stuff is gone, right? So hold on a second. Wow. My apologies. Major meltdown. I lost all my links, so GitLab. And I need to bring up my controller again. And need the study guide for the next one. All right, so cool. I still have this. So we were getting ready to check and make sure that these backups were actually there, and that's where everything went horribly wrong. So I need -I and my SSH key. Yeah, it should be this. All right, so I'm not in the home directory, so change that. CD backups. And again, there's all these. So just to make sure that it actually is working in this permutation, I'll take them out again and run it one more time. Okay. Okay, cool. So it's working. So for the remote server, I can use the remote user, but for the local server where I'm running AAP directly from there and running the playbook back to itself, then I needed to use the Ansible_user. So there was definitely a difference between those two. So that works for the second one, and my Git repository is all up to speed, so that's okay. So now that that we've done that, let's just go ahead and look at the controller and make sure that it works there. So that would be this particular job template. And remember, these are using the exact same playbooks, the same repo. I probably should explain like how it's using the same repo. So we'll do that here in a second. All right. Okay, so it looks like it worked. So let's go ahead and check it out. Okay, yeah, so we have the next set of configs from the two routers. So how it pulls in the repo is from the project. So if I go into the simple backup project, and I'll just go in the edit screen so you can see a little bit better. You can see that in this project here, it points back to that same repo. So it's using when I'm working from Ansible Navigator, it's using the exact same files, and it's using the exact same uh, execution environment as well. So this one here, this is a different one at this level at the project. But the reason why I say it's using the exact same one is because you can have like a hierarchy. You can include an execution environment at the project level, but that would be overridden by one at the template level. So if I go into the template, actually that is that one. All right, so let's change that. So it's all the same everything. Network EE. Yeah, so network EE. I'll launch it one more time. What's happening when it takes a little bit is it's actually pulling in the inventory and it's updating that from the repo that's being updated into the project. So to save time, I can actually turn that off because we're not really changing the inventory every time we're running these. So it makes sense. Like once you know what your inventory is, if it's going to stay stale and static for a while, then you can turn that off. So it just adds like a few more seconds into it while it does that. But right now, it looks like it worked, right? So I go back to here, and then we should have two more, right? So just wanted to make sure it was the same EE. Everything's the same. So whatever we're doing on the Navigator, it should work on the AAP. The difference is credentials that are being used on AAP, where I was using Vault locally. So the credential for this one, if I go back into details from the job and the job template and edit, and I can see that I have this DevNet network is what I use for the routers, but this network SSH one is what I'm using for the server, and it's using an SSH key. So if I go into credentials and oh, you know what? For me to see all the credentials, I need to be admin. Have different access levels due to teams and roles. Now I go to credentials, I see like a lot more, right? So that one was called network. This one right here, edit. And this one has an SSH private key. So that's how we're connecting to that server that's in AWS that has the username EC2-user. So that credential only works in AAP over here. But in my other settings, remember we actually tell it where the key is locally, and then I have the vault has like the username and password for the routers are in there, and then also I could use the vault for the path as well if I don't want to show that in like the Ansible config, but we're not sending that into the repository. So everything that we're doing locally, and everything that we're doing from AAP, it only has access to those files in the repo. So if it's missing something here, then we would have to provide that. So there's no credentials here, so we have to provide that in the AAP. But we do have everything else. And actually, this isn't even the right repo. Let me change that. It is simple backup. It only has access to what's in here, and there's no credentials in here. Just normal variables that we don't mind. Okay, so the next one here that's interesting, right, is the repo. So this is a repo, as is this is a repo, but this repo's whole purpose in life is to save configs to. So if I bring this one up over here, you can see there's just a README file, and it says to check the branches drop down to locate your router backups. So that's what we're doing here is every time we back up, we create a new branch, and that branch has a date and timestamp. So we can use these branches as part of a pipeline. So this would be like a precursor to another demo that I'm going to create for restoring configs. So that way we can actually select a very specific backup configuration from a repo, as opposed to what we could do from a server is because we could locate it, in that folder based off of its naming convention with the timestamps there. But this would actually allow it to be a part of a pipeline, and then if we wanted to, we can merge one of these branches into the main branch, like when we're ready to push into production. So we can kind of emulate that whole like net DevOps pipelines and best practices around that. So that's where this one is interesting because we're using a module that interacts with Git repositories. So it works with GitHub and GitLab. I'm not sure about others beyond that, but I've tested on those two, and it does work just fine. And under the hood, it's using the same types of Git commands that typically you would use, but it's abstracted, so you're just using parameters, and you'll see that from the playbook itself. So this repo is just sitting here. So how do we use it? So let's go back to here in our files, and we'll look at it from a local perspective real quick, right? So from a local perspective, if I go to this backup _git_scm, and we take a look at it, we can see here it says uncomment to run locally. And I actually have it uncommented here, which will be a problem when we run it in AAP because it's not going to be able to find a vault password. It's going to want to use a credential, so it's going to get complaint about us sending this here. So I should let me save it like this real quick and update real fast. This time something more descriptive. Control S, get rid of you, sync you. All right, so now I'm going to change it back, but only locally. File, save, and bring my files back. So when I run this, it's going to need to know some information that's in this vault file. So before I run it, let's just be clear there. So the first thing it's going to do is, in that repo, we saw that it had a README, and that's all that was in the main branch. So we're going to pull that down. We're going to pull down that entire repo, which includes that main branch. And also, it also would include those other branches that were from previous backups. And those would become available in the execution environment in this temporary directory. And it'll be called the remote backups merge. So it's going to create a folder from the merge. I mean, not from the merge, from the clone. So when you clone it down, it'll give it the name of the repo. which is this one right here. Routers underscore backups underscore merge. So temp / this. But it only will be available on the EE, right? Because we're using Navigator. So the other part is just like we've done before. Once we pull that down, we want to run our backups. So we'll pull the backups from the routers, the two routers, using that same module that we have been, using this condition when it's the iOS group, right? So localhost is only used here when we're talking about interacting with the repo. So we haven't used localhost yet. So we use local server, but that actually was tied to an Ansible underscore user and password. So localhost is used in this context. It would be like everything is terminated or originated rather locally from where we're running the Ansible core engine. So in this case, it's running inside that execution environment. So that's where localhost is. So we're going out and interacting with the repo. We're merging the files back, and then they're available. We run our config module against these routers. And then from that, we have the routers saved to this backups underscore merge folder locally. And we can print it out. So that's what this is just so we can see the files and just make sure that it works as part of the playbook. But what's important here is this particular git underscore publish module. So here I don't have to know a bunch of git commands, which is cool because I know the git commands, or at least most of the ones that I need to like interact with the repositories. But it's kind of nice to just parameterize that. So here's the path that is pulled in from the repo. So this will show like the main branch and the existing branches, and it'll create a new branch for our particular backups for this iteration. And we're going to save those configs and stage those configs in the Git repository and commit those configs, and then ultimately push them to the GitLab repository. So in order to do that, you have to have a username or password, or what I typically use is a token. So we have to provide a token. So we have the path, the token, and then the user, so it knows the account as part of accessing the GitLab repository. So it's required to add the username. So this would be my GitLab username. The email. The email doesn't have to be correct, but it's just, it's required. So Git wants you to include that as well. And then it's going to run as it would, like I did earlier. I did it from here, like the built-in, but if I were to run Git commands, it would look like, and I'm not going to add this one yet because I want to keep that that uncommented line going and not send it out. But like I would do like git add dash all, like to bring in like all the files I've changed, and then I would commit them and then I would push them. But I'm not actually going to do that. But all that stuff is happening under the hood. So if we watch this one with verbosity, you'll see all those things happening. And it's just been parameterized for us. So it's just like an easier to use module, like all modules are, right? They should abstract complexities, and it's just interacting with the GitLab. So having said all that stuff, go ahead and run. The heck do I call it? Yeah. -m standard output. I'll do it with 1D so it's not too crazy and give you a little bit more space to see this. So this right here, this is where we printed out the files. So these are the files from this particular backup, these two files right here. And this is a part of a new branch, and this is the branch name. So this was created using this naming convention that incorporates like the name of our repo, and then also it adds the date and timestamp. So every branch is unique, and we should be able to see this branch in the GitLab. So this one would be 11T190. So T190. So when we go back to here and refresh that, yeah, it's this one. Yeah, so the one on top. So I click on there. Then these are the new files right here. So now I mentioned we could merge these or we can keep them as a separate branch. So the nice thing about this is like normally when you save these to a server, then every time you have a backup, it's just added into that folder. And then you would have to parse through them looking at all the timestamps. Where here you could just look at the stage ID, and then that's how you could tag them and go back in time. So if I wanted to do like a restore to a config, I could point to this stage in a repo, and then we could pull down those files to our execution environment and then push them back to a device, right? So we can create a playbook that could orchestrate that as well. So doing the backup and then doing the restore, and that's something that I'm planning on doing. So just one more here, just to show you real quick from the automation controller. And the automation controller is using credentials, but I had to use custom credentials. So here's what I did here for this GitLab underscore merge. It didn't exist. So I needed a credential that was the username, email, and token. And that's what this is. So here's how you populate the fields, right? So I have a field for token, username, email, and they're required. So that way, if you don't make them required, then you could just populate some of them, but I need all three of those. So all three are required. And then I'm passing them as extra variables into the playbook at runtime. So these would override like any other variables that might have been set for username or whatever. So when I run that particular task that's interacting with the GitLab, then it's going to use these parameters or these variables that were defined in this credential for the token and all that stuff. So that's where these are set. And what I did locally when we ran the navigator is these three were a part of the Ansible vault file that was sitting there locally, which was here. Hold on. For that one, it was right here. And the way that we point it to it is in the playbook, at the top of the playbook. I used vars underscore files, and then that allows me to point specifically directly to a path to a file for variables. So git.yaml was not encrypted, and vars vault.yaml was encrypted. So locally, I used it, but remember, in the repo, I left it commented out because we're not using a vault on that side, and we don't want the AAP to read it in. Then it would expect us to set a vault key to use it on that side. So I wanted to use that custom parameter to show like how to use the custom parameter. So that's the reasons why I did it that way. So when we look at this here, and we go into vars, you see there's no vault here, right? Because we're doing a .git ignore, so it never sends it. So it's not there anyway. And then when we look at the other part of it was the host, right? Or I'm sorry, in the playbook itself. So files. This one's commented out. So this is what the Ansible controller is saying. So it's not going to choke on this one and say, hey, you don't have a vault file here under vars. What are you talking about? So we error, in that regard. So one last thing is I'm going to go back into templates. Oh, and I'm not logged in backup, so I have everything here. So for me to filter it out a bit, it's this one right here. I just need to grab the name of the branch so we can validate it. So 191 right here, T191. And everything looks like it worked, right? So back over here. Going the wrong direction. There's main. I should have deleted all these so it'd be easier to look through. That's 190, 11 branches. It doesn't seem like I see that one. All right, so let me get rid of that real quick, the clutter. So to see branches, you go to branches. Here it is right here. See, 191. It's just a little bit easier to see than that drop down. So that's the one that we did. And then there's our two backups. Just router backups. Okay, so that, oh wow, I didn't realize somebody was sitting out there. Yeah, sorry, missed that one. Well, that concludes the first part of the session. So I'm going to stop the recording. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions on any of that? I'm sorry I cut off and had to join in and all the disruption and everything. But does anyone have any questions on any of those different flavors of config backups? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this one.